So I'm really excited about both our guest speaker as well as our doctoral student today. Our guest speaker is Mr. Nilesh Makan, and I will explain everything about him to you shortly. Hi, Nilesh. And then our doctoral candidate is Juliet Fourie. But Juliet is not only a doctoral candidate, she's an associate faculty of Da Vinci. She's an absolutely wonderful part of the Da Vinci faculty. She runs her own organization as well, which I'll introduce you to a little bit later. She's someone I often engage with and speak at events with. And so I'm really excited to hear her in a different forum today. And as I said last night, in the doctoral and postgraduate diploma and master's opening, we all sometimes are students, and we are sometimes leaders, and we are sometimes parents. So we wear many different hats as adult learners. So today she is our doctoral candidate representing. Nilesh is going to be speaking to us today, and I'm really excited about his topic and just him as a speaker in general. It's about harnessing the power of collective thinking. So for those of you that don't know Nilesh, and I know you got his bio, but I just want to speak to the fact he's the founder of Padawan Consulting. So he really is that true entrepreneurial spirit that we really feel shifts environments and shifts spaces and shifts society. And he basically assists businesses to adopt innovation through agile and design thinking mindsets and practices. So very much a Da Vincian, so to speak. And he's got a very mixed background in terms of education because he's got that really strict IT side of things, which is very much focused on specialized technology, but he's also got the MBA and postgraduate diplomas looking into things like innovation and design thinking, and obviously the MBA being very much focused on business administration, etc. So he comes with a multitude of experience, and he's worked at multiple organizations such as SASL, and he's had really huge roles in these spaces. So for me, looking at an agile and systemic thinker, there is no better example, because I think that what Nilesh shows us is about the social impact of all these aspects in terms of being entrepreneurial. So I just want to say that when we meet someone who is truly passionate about education, it is indeed remarkable. And someone who's passionate about innovation, education, technology, and all the aspects connected to things like thinking and knowledge, etc., connected to business and technology. You really are a true Da Vincian, Nilesh, and I thank you for giving up your time. It is extremely precious, and we look forward to engaging with you. Thank you, Nilesh.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. It's an absolute pleasure, privilege, and honor to be here and to share with you. I know we're going to kind of make it a little bit of a dialogic process, but I thought let me share some slides just to keep some focus on the topic itself. Today, we're going to talk a little bit around dialogue, and particularly around how we use dialogue to harness the power of collective thinking. And in essence, what I want to try and do today is to really provide some insight into dialogue and to facilitate reflective and learning-based through experiences and stories. So it's going to be a very interactive session, and I do please urge you to all chip in whenever you can. And we want to do this in a way that enables us to think at our best, to bring our voices forward, and to listen differently. We want to listen with an intent to shape a conversation that heightens our understanding, not only of each other, but of the world around us. And what we want to do is leave the session feeling energized and engaged with a different level of conversation that will allow us to enhance in dialogue. What I want to do is quickly start off with a little bit of an exercise to get the creative juices flowing. And it's always nice to do this because we're so stuck in our logical ways of thinking. We must try and just break that pattern when we have some of these sessions. So this is an exercise in perspective. And I'd like to ask the audience to just chip in and just shout it out, or if you want to, you can put it in the chat. But what do you see in this little image on the left-hand side in number one? Whatever you see, whatever comes to mind.
So I'll start off and say, one of those fridges, those old-fashioned fridges.
An old-fashioned fridge.
I see we've got a bathroom sink, a tank with an outlet. We've got really exciting... Heather, I see Dr. Heather Good. I see you and I think the same.
So what's lovely about this is that what it is it's a submarine going over a waterfall, and that was what was in the mind of the person that drew it, right? And so now you get the idea, and we're going to go to another one. What do you see in the next image? And please feel free to shout it out. We want this to be collaborative.
Security bird.
What else?
A sunflower.
A sunflower. It looks like a sunflower. I like that.
A windmill.
A windmill. Fantastic.
We've got some comments here saying an antenna.
An antenna. It does look like an antenna.
A spider we've got here.
Oh, fantastic. So that one got it right? It was a spider doing a handstand.
A sprayer.
A sprayer. Brilliant. And what's the third image that you see? Interestingly, a lot of people that see this image give a similar view of what it is. So I always find that quite fascinating when we do this exercise.
A swarm of bees going to look for a place to make their hive.
I can see that. That looks brilliant. Yes.
Now, Dr. Lloyd, I thought it was something very different. Those things at the bottom to me look, like a swimming pool when you've got those handles that you climb up. But I can't figure out what the back would be. So I'm going to go with an upside down funnel.
An upside down funnel. That's fantastic. Anyone else want to take a quick stab?
A slide down, an empty training pool, a teepee, a sky ramp, a chimney, an African hut, a volcano, a power station chimney.
Brilliant. I love that. And so what it is, it's a ski jump, and spectators as seen by the jumper. What I use this slide for is really to just explore the idea that what happens is your brain uses past experiences to give us an incoming sense of data and meaning. And what happens is our consciousness experiences it in our remembered present. So what happens inside our skull is there's a lot of neurons firing, and these gives these lines and blobs some level of meaning based on our past mental model, so what we know in the past. And effectively what's happening in this is our brain is searching through a lifetime of past experiences, looking at 1,000 guesses and weighing in on probabilities, trying to answer those questions, right? And that's what effectively a perspective is. A perspective is saying we've got a certain mental model, and a mental model is effectively what our past is and what our thoughts are and everything that we've met and how that brings us to where we are currently. And the reason we start off with this exercise is to really understand the importance of perspective when engaging in dialogue. So what we will cover today is really around a little bit about what dialogue is, different levels of conversation, how to select between alternatives, and how do we start engaging in more powerful dialogue. So a lot of this work that I'm talking about is based on a book called Dialogue by William Isaacs. And what William Isaacs says is that the way people talk together in organizations is rapidly acknowledged as being central to the creation and management of knowledge. And this is really important in this new economy. We need to start creating more conversations and have some level of collective learning and inquiry. And it's really the process of transforming the way we think and what also lies beneath our thinking. So I often like to start with a dictionary definition of something. And in this case, when we talk about dialogue, the dictionary definition has two particular meanings. The first meaning is either it's a conversation between two or more people as a feature of a play or book or a film, and often we see dialogue in a film. But what we're going to talk about today is really when we take part in a conversation to resolve a problem. And when we look at the word dialogue, it actually stems from the Greek word dialogos, and it's broken down into two words, dia, which means through, and logos, meaning the word. So effectively, if you translate it, it really means the free flowing of meaning between people. And that's what dialogue effectively is. When we think about dialogue in relation to collective intelligence, what we're saying is that collective intelligence is the new knowledge, insight, and thinking that grows out of the collective and which didn't exist at an individual level. So as soon as we start sharing ideas, we start improving the way we think about the world, and we start improving our dialogue, and those ideas then get translated into action, and action leads to innovation. And because innovation is not just an idea, it's an idea with some level of action. So there's a couple of disciplines around team learning, and when we think about it, the discipline of team learning really starts through this notion of dialogue. And there's a systems thinker named Daniel Kim, that talks about how he looks at it. And he uses a reinforcing engine of success feedback loop from a systems perspective. And what he says is that when we have a good quality of relationship, what that does is it starts improving the quality of our thinking. Because we start talking and because we start interacting, our thinking is improved. It's not just a singular view, but it becomes a multiple view of thinking. When we have a better quality of thinking, that results in a higher quality of actions. And the quality of actions effectively leads to a better quality of results, which then reinforces the loop that says that when we have better results, we improve our quality of relationships. So the purpose of dialogue is really just to go beyond one's individual understanding and to have this free flowing of meaning through a group, which allows the group to discover insights that are often not attainable individually. And we do this because when we think about team learning, it's vital because it's in organizations these days, it's teams, not individuals, that are the fundamental learning unit in modern business. So when we think about dialogue, what I want you to do is to really understand that in dialogue, we're not trying to win. In dialogue, we all win when we're doing it right. And that's a really important concept. So I want to kind of just move into a quick discussion around if we look at this particular slide, and I want to start moving into some level of dialogic exploration. How might we improve our quality of relationships in business today that will kick off this reinforcing feedback loop? And I'd like to open the floor to anyone that has any ideas.
Oh, so I'll kick off with the first thought. I think one of the things we need to shift quite dramatically is power dynamics.
And why do you say that? I know why, but why do you say that?
Because they are so pervasively toxic. Well, I think I've become more and more aware of it doing my own research at the moment into dealing with wicked problems, and how we facilitate stakeholder engagement in that context. And one of the issues that comes up over and over and over and over and over again is that power dynamics just get in the way of effective dialogue, in the way of effective problem solving.
There's also comments in the comments chat box for you. It's listening more than speaking, says Charles. Raymond says start with a collective mindset. Franzel says I agree with Janet, but I think more empathy is also essential. Juliet says have better context.
Good morning from a chilly Wisconsin, USA. With respect to the dialogue, my question is, how do we guard against groupthink? That I do fully appreciate and concur with the assessment that the dialogue is an excellent way to move forward because we have to engage in a collaborative experience. But I've also found through the literature and my own personal experience anecdotally that it sometimes devolves into a groupthink. And I'm wondering, what should we think about as we engage in dialogue so we don't go into the depths of the abyss of groupthink?
Absolutely. I think that is it's a pitfall to be wary of. And often when we talk about this idea of dialogue, it's effectively around firstly suspending judgment, our own judgment, and looking at it from a different perspective, right? So from a perspective of generative based outcomes. So when we start looking at it, and it's really about how we practice the ability to listen and listen with intent and listen from a purely different perspective. And I do have a little bit of a slide that I can share a little bit later on. But when we kind of think about this idea of listening, and I'm just going to quickly spitball around these 4 levels of listening that I've read about of late. The first level of listening is really downloading. So what happens is we tend to listen as individuals from another person's perspective, downloading the same information we know. The second level of listening moves further towards factual listening. So what we do is we tend to listen from another person's perspective, but for additional facts that support our argument. So it's still very much on us. The third level of listening moves to an idea of empathetic listening. So we're moving away from self and moving towards other. And in empathetic listening, what we do is, and this is a lot of where coaching and these other disciplines lie, is let's listen from someone else's perspective. Let's try and understand it from someone else's perspective. The fourth level of listening, which is very difficult to get to, but possible, is this idea of generative listening. And in generative listening, we're not listening purely from another person's perspective, but what we're doing is we're listening from a point of problem. And we're trying to understand all those different perspectives in relation to that problem. And it requires us to have a very different awareness around the way we approach dialogue.
I got lost on the generative-based outcome, and then I was trying to swirl my head around that concept and lost everything else afterwards. What do you mean?
So
when you were talking about listening, you said we must do something about
generative listening. So the way
what is that?
So the way I think the easiest way to explain it is if I draw a piece of paper, on a piece of paper, the number 6 as an example, and I look at the number 6 from my perspective, it would look like a 6 to me. But if I put the piece of paper like that and you sitting opposite me, what would happen is that 6 would look like a 9 to you. And the idea when we kind of think about generative listening and generative dialogue is to really think about this idea that's on the table, which says that we know that it's both a 6 and a 9 and everything else in between, but let's share those different perspectives around what you see and why you see that as either a 6 or a 9. And let's not say that, listen, I see this as a 6 purely because this is what I see, but let me suspend my judgment on the 6 and let me understand why you see it as a 9. And that analogy around the 6 and a 9, when it comes to dialogue, is really important. And it's really saying, okay, let's not just understand it from a perspective of two people, but let's get all those perspectives around on that problem, because that problem is its problem. And it exists differently for all of us because we all grew up differently. And the idea behind generative dialogue is really to try and understand what that 6-9 relationship is from everyone's perspective, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
And maybe just to add some perspective. And I think for me, generative is, if you think about it as what can be generated out of this, it becomes an additive process rather than a negating process. It's kind of, well, what happens if we see that perspective and we see that perspective and put them together? What might we get? So I'm not necessarily giving you a finite definition, but it's just such a rich, amazing concept, this idea of the and, you know?
Yes, and such an important facet.
Such a lovely concept, Nilesh.
Tony, does that provide a little bit more clarity?
Well, so the one is generating and the other one is generic. So I was stuck on generic. I was thinking that meant generic, and I was wondering
my
how
pronunciation was. It's my pronunciation.
Yeah, maybe. So
I apologize.
Generative really helped me. Yeah, okay. So, well, I mean, it's a 6 or a 9, isn't it?
It's a 6 or a 9. Absolutely.
So I think what I try and do most of the time, and then I'm accused of not having a stance, is that I try and say, in my perspective, blah, 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 or I think, blah, 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 I believe so-and-so. And so no one can really argue because I think I'm doing what you say we ought to do. But however, then people will say, Tony, take a stance, for goodness sake. You're so neutral. So that's the accusation I get. And I feel that quite a lot sometimes because it's like you're the sissy in the group because I think I'm doing what you think you're saying we ought to do. So I'm just sharing some of my experiences because I do negotiate a lot for the transport industry, wage negotiations for the truckers.
When I think about that, I like to think of it as rather let's tell stories from our perspectives. So not just I think, but this is what happened to me. And this is my perspective because it happened to me. Because when you share a story that relates to a challenge, it makes it real for everyone. People can understand it a little bit easier. When you say, I think this is how it should be done, and then it may be misconstrued as being non-committal. But if you just share a story and say, this is my perspective, then no one can really argue that, in my opinion.
Yeah, I do use my perspective mostly.
Okay.
And when I'm using the word I think, it's normally in the context of a perspective or a belief. But I've never told a story, so maybe that grounds it more. Yeah, I'm not a big storyteller. So yeah, okay, thanks.
Something we all have to learn as leaders, though, how to be better storytellers.
Oh, that's interesting.
So I'm going to kind of skip the slide, but really what this slide does in essence is it looks at Peter Senji's work on the fifth discipline and the 5 disciplines of organizational learning, and how when we think about communicating and team learning, how we think about mental models, and I don't want to go into this because it will just detract, and I'd rather get into the dialogue a little bit later. So I'm going to kind of skip over this a little bit. But what I want to know, or at least have a conversation and a discussion on, is this idea, and one of the key concepts in systems thinking is this idea of a distinction. So we know that this is something that is different to this. And what I want to do is kind of just ask some questions, right? So if we think about this idea of when we get into typical meetings, often those meetings tend to be a discussion, and in some instances it's a debate. So you can think of someone going on a podium and having a debate. What we want to do is kind of move from that space of discussion or debate into a space of dialogue, right? And to do that, we kind of have to think about what that means very differently. And Tony, I hope this does help in terms of trying to understand how this works. So if we think about a discussion or a debate, and we say that in a discussion or a debate, the intent is to inform or to assess or to argue or to win. What do you think, if you think about the idea of a dialogue and what that brings, what does that aim to do instead? And I'm going to ask people to just shout it out and give me some ideas, please.
I would say to engage.
To engage. That's brilliant. What else?
To try and develop some form of common knowledge around an issue, to grow towards a basis of common knowledge, maybe around an issue. Just to understand.
Right. And all those things do tend, right? So when we think about dialogue, what we want to do is try and connect with each other. We want to try and grow understanding, to be able to share our views and perspectives, and to be able to create something emerging that comes out of that. When we focus on a discussion or a debate, we tend to focus on logical argument, right? This is what I say because this must be true. What do you think we focus on when it comes to dialogue?
Meaning.
Meaning. I like that.
Maybe it's more emotional.
Emotional. Fantastic.
And relational.
There you go. It's absolutely right. So we're not focusing on the logical. We're focusing on the relationships between the team to try and really understand it from each other's perspectives. It is purely around relationships and emotions. If we think about knowledge having a lot of power in a discussion, what happens with knowledge in a dialogue? What is knowledge?
Well, I'm going to take your example of this, share stories.
Share stories. Fantastic. What else?
Yeah.
Facilitates understanding.
Lovely, lovely. I love that. So absolutely, it's shared. It's about that facilitation of understanding through shared meaning. In a discussion or a debate, we often assume that we're right? This is the way it is, and this is what I say. But when we move into a space of dialogue, what do we appreciate instead?
Perspectives.
Fantastic. I love it.
Different opinions.
Different opinions, different perspectives, and that's exactly right. Diverse perspectives. You speak to very smart people when they get all of them right. So in a discussion or a debate, what we're trying to do is you go in and we're defending our position. This is what I say. This is what I think. This is my position, right? What happens in dialogue instead?
I think in dialogue, one aims to put forward a sentence or words that allows the other person a safe space to respond feel threatened or ridiculed by responding because you've structured the sentence in an open-ended fashion, closed thing at the end of it.
Yes. The yes and that we talked about earlier, right? It's generative. Yeah. It's more. What else can we say?
I would say you create a community, and more specifically, a community of learners. You have to let go of that ownership stake, particularly if it goes to your identity. Mm. So it's tough to do, but it is something with feedback and repetition that is achievable.
I like that.
Create consensus.
Creating those shared views, beliefs and emotions, but you could also, and this is where I think you talked about that open space, right? How do we allow sharing wild ideas with some level of agency? And that in summary is what you said, right? It's creating that space for people to come together and say, this is what my views are. Let's talk about weaknesses and flaws, right? So in a discussion or a debate, you're looking at the other person, or in a negotiation, for example, you're saying, what is the weakness? What is the flaw that I can, what do we do when we talk about, when we think about this from, what do we seek in dialogue?
Strengths and what we can learn from others.
Strengths and what we can learn. Right. What else?
And potential value.
Potential value. I love that.
I often, like in a dialogue, now that I understand what you're saying here, is I like to be able to hear words and sentences and thinking that I would never have thought of before had I not engaged in a dialogue fashion with the other person or people. So it makes a big difference to me to hear how an English word might be spoken to me, and I've had a different understanding of that word and how it enriches me back to see how that word is played in a sentence and in an environment that they're coming from. It adds a lot to me and helps me grow, actually. So in a dialogue, I often seek to expand my understanding of a verb or a noun.
Right, and just to summarize everything you say, that's exactly right. It's about this. So what you're saying is you want to try and get some shared meaning, and you talked about insight in some way or form, right? So when I heard what you said, you were saying that you want to learn more, you want to get some insight into how different things work. And that's exactly what happens in dialogue. So you aim to suspend your judgment so that you can get access to some shared meaning and insight. So what happens is in a discussion, we tend to listen and react, and we often suppress differences.
Hello, are you hearing me?
Anything in particular that you want to bring to our attention? So you said if a story is told in order to share experiences, then it's informative. But if it's told in order to find solutions, then different people want the solution to serve in their different purposes. So what you're saying is that in a shared experience, it becomes more informative. But if it's told, then it serves a very different purpose.
Yeah. It depends on the purpose of the dialogue. You get what I'm saying? If the dialogue is the purpose to share information, then people can listen to your experience. People can listen to your experience and probably learn something from that. You're just informing them about it. But if you are going to try to, if the purpose of the dialogue is to find solution to a particular problem or a particular situation, I think if people have different perspectives to that problem or that situation, they might want to see different solutions to the problem.
Nilesh, Dr. Du Plessis agrees with Dr. Emeka, or put a similar comment earlier to say shared meaning and mutual understanding as well. So I agree with Dr. Emeka in terms of, I think purpose is really quite a critical aspect.
Purpose is important as well as intent, right? So when we go into when we start engaging in a manner of dialogue, the idea is to explore and say, what is our intent? What do we want to get out of this? So if we kind of look at just a simple way of doing that is in the beginning of a presentation, we kind of put up a little slide to say that we would like to do this so that in a way that. And once we get that intent, when we get that shared vision out, then we can engage in a very different way. So if we want to just engage by sharing information, then we kind of say that's what our intent is. But if we want to engage differently and we want to learn about a problem and make sure that we understand that purpose, we have to at least put that intent out there and that's the way I look at it. It's about establishing the right context and intent to begin with.
If you start from the beginning to say put it in perspective, I think people understand exactly what the purpose of the discourse.
Absolutely.
Then people will have less expectation, or maybe have an expectation that is not relevant to the discourse or the dialogue or something like that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Good.
Nilesh, we've got a couple of other comments, things like seek surprises to understand others' point of view. In some, that dialogue encourages hope for one and all. So there's quite a lot of comments, and Dr. Meka's point earlier was if a story is told in order to share experience, it's informative. If it's told in order to find solution, then different people will want the solution to serve their different purposes.
I fully concur. That's absolutely right. And the idea is then to say how if it is the latter, how do we approach that as a collective? To continue, when we kind of look at discussion and debate, we aim to listen and react to suppressed differences. What happens in dialogue? What do we aim to do there? What do we listen for?
I think one would listen for commonalities.
Commonalities, yes.
Franzella, I think your point here, Dr. de Ploy-Cilliers, also goes with shared meaning. Trying to have a shared meaning, because I think that's quite important. Gibson has said, Gibson, I'm not sure if I'm right, rapprochement. Is that correct, Gibson?
Rapprochement. What does that mean?
I'm not sure. Gibson, can you comment? And then James has commented, listen for understanding and for empathy.
Absolutely.
Gibson, do you mind?
Well, dialogue, it depends at what level it is. In international politics, we've got rapprochement. In France, I think it's derived from French, so that's why it's not rapprochement, it's rapprochement. Marine Africans could be too nadering, which means trying to get to it. It happens when a dialogue is at a high level, say, for example, to get that international relations between nations. That's my understanding in political science.
On the one side, listen to react and suppress difference. We're saying on the other side, we're looking for agreement. I would like to suggest that before we get to agreement, maybe we're looking to really see difference and see the value in difference.
To explore.
And to appreciate what that might mean.
And just to kind of get back to the slide, it is about that, right? It's around that connection. It's about understanding and listening to connect as well as to reflect. In the discussion, often what happens is the loser surrenders, right? Okay, that's fine, I'll do it your way. But in dialogue, it has to be different, right? So what do we try and do in a dialogue as opposed to a loser surrendering?
I think it's also reaching a point of common understanding or agreement around an issue that you can build on and still retaining particular perspectives that could form the basis of something going forward, where you find further evidence or information. But it's certainly a dialogue has the purpose eventually of a meeting of the minds around a key issue that you can then agree on to move forward, especially in dire environments where you have to have a dialogue. I'm just thinking of the situation in Ukraine, for example, where dialogue might sound a very meek and mild approach, but dialogue certainly is very important in such circumstances as well.
It's trying to get to that idea where we respect all points of views, and it's also doing it without the need to reach a consensus, right? Because what we're trying to do in dialogue is not just reach consensus, but what we're trying to do is reach some level of understanding. Where is the other people or person coming from? Where is she coming from, as an example? Rather than just, this is my view and I'm going to say it where it is. So in a dialogue, if you don't reach consensus, it's okay. But what you want to do is start building that ability to respect those points of view and understand where other people are coming from based on their backgrounds and histories. And then the last one I know is reasonably easy. And then we can just break out, continue the conversation without slides. But obviously, from a discussion perspective, silence can be quite tense. What happens with silence in dialogue?
James says dialogue, when effective, allows for blue ocean opportunity. Dr. Lloyd says absolutely building understanding. Deerwald says comfortable. Brian?
Yeah, just a general comment on this discussion and dialogue. And many years ago, I was at the CSIR, and we were involved in doing some work with a technique for technology forecasting called the Delphi technique.
I remember that.
And a big issue in any group discussion or any group dialogue was the effect of personality. That sometimes you had a personality who, just because of their charisma, their presence, tended to dominate and introduce a bias into the group. And so the methodology that was used was to create what we called a nominal group, whereby you had a central person who would then receive all the comments, but they would be received in a written format, and the personality involved would not know who it is, and then it would be shared amongst the group, and then they would comment on it, not knowing the originator, not knowing the individual behind it. And that way one got a very different set of findings and results coming out, a far higher quality, because the effect of dominant personality had been removed from the discussion and the dialogue.
Thank you for sharing. I love that Delphi technique. Thank you. So I think so silence, we all agree. It allows for it's actually welcomed, right? So we want to be silent so that it's reflective, and the Delphi technique allows that, right? It allows all those different perspectives to be shown without dominant voices being, the highest paid person's opinion in the room, right? And which is often the case. So it's a great way and great technique. Thank you for sharing that, Brian. So that just, for the last few minutes, any other questions or, any other views on dialogue, comments, I'd be happy to field it, or just to just learn and share some other ideas around dialogue.
Pauline, your comment says destroys discussion. I assume that was from earlier from silence. And James, sorry, I missed it. It says silence is reflective. It allows for reflection.
And I concur, James. I think we have to be a bit more reflective, right? I think we have to sit back and say, okay, I've really heard what's being said, and I'm internalizing it before I respond, because often we respond very quickly with biases. So how do we become more reflective about what was said? And that requires some level of silence to sit and just ingest that in some way or form.
So I'm not sure if anyone wants to engage further with Nilesh. I know people have been extremely active and engaging, and I think that you've been really incredible, Nilesh. So I'm not sure if anyone wants to make a last comment before I ask Letta to share her screen. Okay, so Nilesh, I just want to say people really thank you for, I think everybody will agree. I saw lots of hearts and thumbs up earlier around things. I think you've been a truly engaging speaker. And when we speak of curiosity and we speak of being curious, I think you've piqued our curiosity in multiple ways, but also just the engaging and cooperative approach which you took. Curiosity is meant to be a roundtable discussion, and now we're a virtual roundtable. And I think you really made us feel that we were, as you can see in the comments, everybody is thanking you and really just saying how much they enjoyed the discussion. So we really hope we can have you back very soon to engage with us further. I'm now going to ask Letta. What she does is she graphically represents what you said whilst you are busy talking. So over to you, Letta.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Coonan. So we spoke about harnessing the power of collective thinking through dialogue. And I particularly love this exercise around different perspectives. And what Nilesh said to us, we make sense of things based on our past experience. That perspective becomes our own, but it's not the only perspective that is valid. He spoke about Dialogue by James Isaacs and the fact that dia through the word helps us to transform, to make improvement, and to lead people through to action. He spoke about the quality of our relationships, impact the quality of our thinking, impacts the quality of our action, and obviously impacts the quality of the results. And then we go through the process again. It's about learning. It's about improving. The question is, how can we improve the quality of relationships? And what we heard from you guys was think about the power in relationships, listen more, show empathy, understanding the context, suspending judgment. The comment was also made, be careful not to fall into that groupthink. And if you think about it, it's not really around groupthink. It's more about thinking within the group to create that shared meaning. Share the stories around what happened to you. The power of those stories are amazing. The levels of listening, downloading factual, just listening for the information or listening in order to respond, and then moving into level 3 and level 4, which is more generative listening. What do you see and why do you see that? And the example of the 6 and the 9 was discussed. What can we generate from all of these perspectives? If we think about the difference between a discussion and a debate and a dialogue, a discussion and a debate is around assessing and forming. It's always a winner and a loser. One person says yes, another one says no. It's about trying to win. Where a dialogue is really around engaging, learning, finding that common ground, understanding the yes and getting to that shared meaning, the shared understanding. The rapprochement, we've got that. The toenadering in Afrikaans, we've got that as well. Really getting to a win-win situation, opening up the ideas around blue ocean thinking, what is possible, and that the silence really helps us to reflect. It's about the purpose and the intent. And then we also spoke about the Delphi techniques, where it's about ideas and not personalities, around creating shared meaning. And that is the visual summary.
Wow, that's so impressive.
So Nilesh, you'll see that once Juliet has finished, Letta will present the whole image, and then afterwards we will send it to you and Juliet as a souvenir for today, but also to all the participants today to also share and enjoy it. So I would like to say thank you so much.